so, and that is Gary Danielson. Gary, thanks for being with us as always, and want to get your initial thoughts about the Iron Bowl this past weekend.
Somewhat of a mismatch. Not really very surprised about it. There was only, I don't know if there was even a way for Auburn to win. They needed to do what they did. They needed to have a couple of off-balance plays, something like a block punt, a high turnover game by Alabama, and they stayed in the game. But I thought the impressive part of Alabama was they stayed patient, and then when the opportunity to make the big plays arose, they made them, and that's why this Alabama team is so different than past Alabama teams. They can beat you any way. It's funny. Usually a team can beat you, a way they want to. Alabama can beat you any way the opposite team chooses. If the opposite team wants to give them the run, Alabama will run it down your throat. So if they want to throw, they can do it that way. There's just a lot of different ways this team can make you succumb to their power and their immense talent on offense this year.
Gary, and a lot of weapons, and one guy that you've mentioned a ton on the broadcast, and I know somebody that it was really a diamond in the rough coming out of high school, Josh Jacobs, and
right.
Man, this kid, that the way that he was able to adjust to that throw where Tua put it in the perfect spot away from the defenders, but for a running back out of the backfield to catch it, then make a guy miss, get into the end zone. I mean, this guy's stock in the NFL has got to be going up every single game.
Yeah. A few years back, I remember watching Alvin Kamara and Kenyon Drake be the scout team running backs for Alabama, and I said, "Who are these guys?" And I don't know who the defenders were, but we would interview them. They go, "Yeah, we can't handle it. They're too good. They're future stars." And right about at the beginning of his career at Tennessee, with Leonard Fournette and Nick Chubb were breaking the records, and I'm not sure who Alabama had at that point. It was probably a pretty good running back, whoever it was. I thought that Alvin Kamara was the best back in the league, and said so on a broadcast to a lot of criticism. I think that this is what Josh Jacobs is going to look like in a couple years when he gets into the NFL. He's their best blocker. He's their best receiver. And when he runs with an attitude that makes the rest of the team better. He really is a unique football player, and you could see it even at the beginning of this year. And I've had defensive coaches tell me that they're all really good backs, but the guy who's the difference maker is number 8 for Alabama.
Gary, you've obviously studied both Alabama and Georgia extensively. What are your initial thoughts of the on the SEC championship game?
I think this Georgia team brings a lot more on offense than what they did a year ago, and that's really hard, a mouthful, because of just how good they were at running back last year. The impact that Nick Chubb and Sony Michel is making, plus they had a number 1 draft pick at left tackle and Isaiah Wynn. But I still think they're better because they're so much more comfortable throwing the ball. I watched, Jake last year, and he was being protected through most of the year. Now, in this championship game, and I really only broke down the first quarter of last year's championship game, but Georgia started out the game with 7 straight passes against Alabama last year. So you could tell the respect, and you could tell what they felt they had to do. But this year, I think you're going to see more of that. You're going to see, I think, an emerging quarterback in Jake Fromm. For a while, I fell into the trap of thinking Jake was just a game manager. Last year I thought he really was. I don't mean this with any disrespect because he ended up playing in the pros. I really thought he was a McElroy, that he was managing the team. But I think this year he's an A.J. McCarron in the type of the way that their team trusts him, and he's a whole different weapon. I think their receivers have a lot of different parts, and I think Swift and Holyfield have been able to replace, not completely, not 100%, but I think they're 90% of what they were at running back. I think it's a much better offensive football team. That is not what's probably going to decide the game, although if you're going to play Alabama, I've been saying this all year, you almost have to feel that if your defense does a good job, you got to spot them 28 points. So you got to get in the 30s. And I think this Georgia team could get in the 30s. The problem for this Georgia team is whether they can keep Alabama to 28. That really is going to be their problem.
When you look at the stats, Georgia, the Bulldogs defense, they are number 12 in the FBS, but they have some weak areas in this defense. And Georgia's last in the SEC in two defensive categories, and tackles for loss, they're number 118 in FBS, and team sacks, number 111 in the FBS. So as far as pressure on Tua and these guys, if they do it, it's going to have to come out of the secondary, it looks like. And when you do that, you really put yourself out there to be very vulnerable to some big plays with these wide receivers. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it can't be that way. This Georgia defense cannot depend on any sacks. I mean, maybe once in a while for a changeup, but if that's a steady diet of blitzing 5 or 6 players, Tua will pick them apart. You saw what happened to Auburn. Auburn hung in there with man-to-man coverage, and I do believe that's something you have to play against Alabama, especially on early downs when they use their RPOs. But if you do that on third down consistently, Tua will pick you apart. You get rid of it too fast. And the receivers, the 4 wide receivers for Alabama, when they catch passes, the one guy becomes an instant runner and the other 3 become instant blockers. It's amazing to watch how fast the other guys get out of their pass route and look for somebody to block. It looks like it's a planned play when it gets into the secondary. Of course it's not, but all of them are so good after the catch, and Tua throws guys into the open. He throws at guys and they catch it on the run. I really feel that the story of this football game is if Georgia's front 5, their 3 down linemen and their 2 inside linebackers get dominated, they're in deep trouble. They just cannot bring extra people consistently and live to tell about it. They have to have a 4-man pass rush on nickel, and they're just going to have to live with it, mixing up the coverages and try to hope that Tua has one of those days that he just hasn't had.
Gary, a lot of national college football writers are already saying that Alabama is in the playoffs regardless of what happens in the SEC championship game. Do you agree with that assessment? If Alabama loses, they're still in?
I think there's a good chance of that. I right at this point, I think only one team, this is how I would put it, one team is 100% in, and that's Notre Dame. I think Clemson is about 95% in. I mean, if they get beat because of the weakness of their conference, they could get edged out here. So, I mean, they should win that game, 95 out of 100, so I'm putting it 95%. I think that if Alabama loses, they're still at that 95 to 99% that they're in. Most likely they are, simply because I think it would be laughable to have somebody on that committee stand up there and say they're not one of the 4 best teams. But, you never know. You leave out that little bit of percentage. What if they get beat badly? It has never happened in a Nick Saban loss. Or if something would happen to Tua and they lose, I could see where somebody would say, the committee would argue that instead of taking 2 from the SEC, especially with a potential blowout loss, hard to even say that. I'm not predicting that, obviously, and I don't want anybody to think that. But if there was a worst case scenario, I could see him getting, but you're really dealing with a hypothetical that's not likely to happen. So I really do think that even if they lose and it's a normal game, they will be in, yes.
Visiting with Gary Danielson, CBS Sports, here on the Jay Barker Show with Lars Anderson and Kerry.
The flip of that, though, is where Georgia has the problem. The loss to LSU, if they lose the game, and the fact that Alabama will be number 1, and let's suppose that something happens to Oklahoma and they're being compared to a 1-loss Ohio State, or let's suppose it's the opposite. Ohio State loses and they're being compared 1-on-1 to Oklahoma. The problem with the scenario is it would be a rematch with Alabama. And I really don't know if the committee would want to do that. Put number 1 and have them play the last game of the year and then have them turn around and play the next game of the year. So I think that Georgia has a path, obviously, but I think them with a loss would be way more unlikely.
Gary, final question, and I know this weekend may have a little bit to do with it, but his season has been absolutely amazing. Your thoughts on Tua, Heisman, and is there I guess outside of Kyler Murray, who else do you think might have a chance?
Well, I think he should win it. I think the way he's dominating the whole college football season, he's changed Alabama football probably forever. It started with Nick Heyer and Lane, and realizing that college football has changed. It really, and people have heard me say that, it really started with the RPO pass that Nick Marshall hit against them at the end of that game before the kick six. That's when he said, all right, if that's the new rules, I'm changing. And Lane was a great bridge. I think Tua is the next step, and I think this is what you'll see from now on. And ironically, in this game, Tua played the second half and had that magnificent fourth quarter and overtime finish. But the goal for Georgia is going to be more Tua. They need to get Tua to play in the fourth quarter. So it's funny. If Tua only played a half last year and beat them, the goal for Georgia is to make them play a full game. It doesn't seem logical, but that's really the way it is.
Gary, always a pleasure. Thanks for being with us on this championship week.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.